Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, college football edition. The schedule rolls on and waits for no one. Early October as the national championship landscape continues to take shape, at least theoretically. We'll have a couple of great measuring sticks on the docket this weekend. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleagues and co-hosts, Payne Insider and Brad Powers. And gentlemen, how goes it this fine Wednesday?
Doing well. Thanks for asking.
No complaints.
All right, no complaints is a good place to start. We can only go down from there the way I see it when we try and dissect some of the big games on the board. When we start to look at the market, Brad, I mean, we now have 4 or 5 data points. Do you start to get more and more comfortable with who some of these teams are, or do you feel that the non-conference strength of schedule disparity still hasn't tipped its hand in terms of what we're going to see as far as some of the top teams in the country?
Good question. Case-by-case basis. I mean, from what you said there, number one, I do like it because you start connecting the dots, not only, from, what you've done with 4 or 5 data points, but then you start, what did your opponents, what have they done in those 4 or 5 data points? So there's certainly that. I like that in regard, but obviously, we also have big-time disparities on who's actually played somebody. What I would consider, do we have good data points or bad data points? And some of the teams at the top of college football, specifically the top 2 teams, I'm not, we don't have a lot of good data points on the Georgias and the Michigans of the world.
Well, it's the perfect segue because that'll give us the optimal place to kick things off, guys. When we talk about 2 teams that are undefeated in the SEC East, and I know the running joke coming into the year for all of us was we weren't sure how often Georgia was going to be talked about on this podcast because at least on paper, their schedule looked to be extremely favorable. But when you go out there, you continue to be lethargic in first halves against the first 2 SEC opponents. You allow inferior teams to hang around, and that's what we've seen from Georgia, who needed that big play from Brock Bowers last week down there at Jordan-Hare to come away with a win. And when we look at Georgia, they'll welcome in an undefeated Kentucky Wildcat side fresh off a 33-14 drubbing of the Florida Gators. And it's Georgia more than a 2-touchdown favorite, 14.5 the consensus in this game, total of 49. And Georgia's won 13 straight games versus Kentucky. We know they've won a ton of games overall. And when you look at the way this series has gone, they've won 6 straight meetings by 10-plus points, and they've held Kentucky largely at bay, keeping them to 17 or fewer points in each of those matchups. The Wildcats are seeking their third 6-0 start in program history. Happened in 1950 and happened as recently as 2021. But this will be their first road game, so we'll see if things are as favorable when they leave Lexington for the first time this season. Meanwhile, Georgia, they've trailed by double digits in consecutive SEC games for the first time since 2016, but obviously were able to win their 22nd straight overall. Georgia remains one of the only teams in the country still looking for its first cash at the betting window with a winless ATS mark thus far. The Bulldogs should be a little bit healthier this week than what they've been, getting some key reinforcements back into the mix. But Payne, when we look at this football game and we try and assess who Kentucky is, they've now scored 28-plus points in 5 straight games for the first time since 2006-2007. They've been able to manufacture offense from their special teams and defense with 4 non-offensive touchdowns this season, tied for the most in the FBS. But anyone who watched them last week against Florida, it didn't appear that they were doing anything exotic. They went out there, they played smash-mouth football. Devin Leary turned around, handed the ball off to Ray Davis, and he continued to run into wide-open space on nearly every time early in that contest. And against a Georgia defense that was gashed largely by the quarterback run, do you see a path to success for Kentucky offensively, knowing they've been largely one-dimensional, even with an experienced quarterback under center in Devin Leary?
Liam Cohen, baby. He's certainly helped improve the scoring offense. Now, I don't think you're going to be able to run right at Georgia, and I think it's a little surprising Kentucky was able to run right at Florida because that's where the meat is. That's where the strength is. It wasn't necessarily off tackle runs or outside zone. It was literally like right at the meat eaters inside, which is a little surprising. But I think about this matchup that happened back in 2021, because that's when Liam Cohen was last with Kentucky, and he had Will Levis and Wan'Dale Robinson and Chris Rodriguez, and he took that trio to Athens, and it was a lot of like quick throws. There was a lot of misdirection. There was motion. There was play action. And you saw the game plan. It was basically Will Levis releasing the ball in like 2.2 seconds on average in that game when he was kept clean. And the A-dot was like just a shade over 4 yards. And he threw with play action a bunch, 36% of dropbacks. I don't think you need to show this version of Georgia's defense as much respect as the historically elite 2021 Georgia defense. But I don't think Kentucky has the ability to execute that type of game plan even if they tried. I'm thinking back to that 22-play, 11-minute drive Kentucky had to end that game in 2021. It's just nuts. But I say that because
that was just Stoops playing for the cover. Let's not sugarcoat it in any capacity here. He had one goal in mind there, and it was trying to get his backers to the window. Could care less about trying to win a football game.
Yeah, but my point is the style of which they employed, right? It was that down-to-down efficiency. And, like, if you look at Kentucky this year, they haven't been able to be that, right? They've basically lived off the explosive 16 plays of 30-plus yards, and that's really what's allowed Kentucky's offense to survive. Kentucky right now, top 25 in explosive offense, but outside the top 80 in down-to-down success. And so, like, I don't think you can employ that strategy, and I'm not really sure just running right up the middle is going to work either, even though Georgia's D-line is a little bit down this year. You look at the passing game with Devin Leary, which you kind of hinted at the top, is, I'll say this nicely, has lacked rhythm. He's been inaccurate on 35% of his throws. We like the receiver group, and I think positive regression's coming, but they really haven't helped a bunch. When you look at Dane Key, 24% drop rate. Berrien Brown, 17% drop rate. I think your main question at the top is really astute. It's something I pointed out, and then you mentioned via text, and I just gave you the wink because we were both on the same page. But if you watched both Kentucky and Georgia play last week, your mind tells you Kentucky should be able to run the ball here. And maybe they're going to find some success just because Ray Davis is a monster, right? I mean, you just look at that Florida performance. He averaged more than 8.3 yards per rush attempt after first contact. And then your mind goes to the afternoon game where you saw Peyton Thorne. Oh, Jesus Christ, I didn't know he could run like that.
That may have been that may have been the best text I got from Payne. He goes, "Is this the same Peyton Thorne in Michigan State that couldn't move in the pocket?" I go, "Yep, one and the same."
Did you see that run down the sideline? I mean, it was like he was running by everybody. Touched. He was, but it must have been running a 4.4. He was running by everybody. And then you got a dash of Robbie Ashford in there. So it appeared like there was a ton of like great rushing success, but you kind of dig into those numbers a little deeper. Georgia only allowed 1.4 yards per rush before first contact on like traditional running back runs. And I think that's the important distinction because Devin Leary isn't much of a threat to take off and run in the designed RPO game like Thornton and Ashford. Kentucky has this like pro style run game. Georgia is 9th in the country in tackling, so all the yards after first contact probably diminish a bit this week. You look at Kentucky's offensive line. There's a question mark coming into the season. They've certainly performed better than expectation, but the starting five up front for Kentucky heading to Athens, not a single one has a run block grade over replacement level so far this season. But if Georgia can stop the traditional run game, I think they'll be able to create some chaos. I know Georgia's, relatively speaking, for the talent they haven't really gotten to the quarterback over the years as much as you would think. This year, it's a little bit serviceable in getting pressure and sacks on passing downs. And right now, I think because of that lack of down-to-down efficiency for Kentucky's offense, there's going to be some spots here where Georgia's defense can make some plays. If you look at Kentucky, they're outside the top 120 in average third down distance to go. They've played a schedule that's outside the top 90. So I think there's going to be some opportunities for Georgia to get after the quarterback. To me, the price stands out. And I think the ability to read a market and understand what it's saying is important. And it's obviously not the end-all, be-all because we'd never find edges if we really thought the market was perfect. But I see 14.5 with two undefeated teams, and one looked like a cool million last week. The other struggled. You get this 7 p.m. ESPN game, lots of eyes, lots of handle, and it just feels like they're begging for Kentucky money here.
You know, one of the things reading about Georgia and their performance defensively against Auburn that stuck out was a great quote from Kirby Smart, and I'll read it, word for word. "I was riding home on the bus in a state of depression about our ability to stop the run. As a coach, and my dad always said it's never as good as it seems and it's never as bad as it seems. When I got up and actually watched it being the film, we struck blockers and played the run well at times. We didn't fit some plays well that they did, and give them credit. We probably didn't work some of those plays enough out of the formations that they did it. They did a nice job of scheming it up." When you've won back-to-back national championships, I think on some level as a head coach, you appreciate the games where your team doesn't go out there and operate like a well-oiled machine, because you know that following week in practice, you're going to be able to get everyone's attention. We saw Kirby try and drum up fan interest, calling everybody out in their first SEC game, and I think the three of us thought, okay, Georgia's been sleepwalking. They're finally going to wake up against South Carolina. They didn't do it then. Maybe this is what it takes now after they went on hostile territory, didn't play their best, and were able to win by a touchdown. But Brad, before we...
Those are the best kinds of games, Todd.
100%.
Right? Where you win, but you still have the teaching moment that you can use the next week.
Yeah, no 18-year-old kid is listening, hey, you need to improve on your technique after you beat a team 63-7. They're tuning out. They think they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. But, Brad, before we get into the other side of the ball, Payne talked a little bit about the market. And obviously, we know about Georgia. They were the short shot to win the national title. They came in with pedigree. We know how they've been recruiting. What have you done, given their ATS struggles to start the season in terms of their power number? And what have you done to Kentucky on the flip side, knowing that last week against Florida, probably the only true data point that might be illustrative of who the Wildcats can be this season?
Yeah, I've obviously downgraded Georgia since the start of the season. Still number one, but I've downgraded them 5 points. Just not, the inability to cover point spreads is a big favorite. But, the two SEC games against, in my opinion, average at best to below average SEC teams, big time struggles, and not because of like a big time turnover, negative turnover disparity. It's just flat and getting beat up a little bit at the line of scrimmage. Shocked at that first half with the Auburn rush success that they were able to have against Georgia's defense. So downgrade 5 points for Georgia. Kentucky's flat, believe it or not, even though they're unbeaten. I certainly upgraded them after last week a couple of points. But before that, I wasn't overly impressed. Fortunate cover against Ball State. Struggled mightily against an FCS opponent. Akron, just a meandering game there. And then, I thought the Vanderbilt game was a phony final because of a couple of defensive touchdowns. So I wasn't, really high on them until what I saw last week. So right now, flat. But we'll see on Saturday night. I got a sneaky suspicion I might be back to where I was prior to the Florida game.
You mentioned that Vanderbilt game, and after watching Vanderbilt for 4 full quarters with a bet on the Commodores against Missouri last week, I'm not sure what that data point told us about Kentucky, but we can figure some of that out as we continue to go. As far as Georgia offensively, though, Brad, we thought there was going to be a transition. Todd Monken, really knew what his players and his personnel were capable of going out and executing. Mike Bobo hasn't gotten the most out of this group, but if you're looking for a silver lining, Georgia's final 4 possessions against Auburn yielded 17 points and 2 kneel downs, of course, when they were able to close that thing out. When you look at Georgia, they've gotten off to awful starts, the worst scoring margin of any team in the country for the first quarter. It's indicative in terms of being inside the top 20, but we have seen flashes of Carson Beck starting to get more comfortable. They get Ladd McConkey back last week. Brock Bowers has inserted himself right in the thick of things as far as the Heisman Trophy discussion is concerned, and in steps a Kentucky defense that, quite frankly, you go through the list of opponents, hasn't faced NFL caliber talent at the quarterback position. Maybe Carson Beck isn't that, but definitely not in the receiver room, other than what we saw Ricky Pearsall do and have some success last week at Florida.
Yeah, so it's been pretty surprising to say the least as far as Georgia offensively. Obviously, Carson Beck, major question mark, replacing a guy that was a steady hand for them for the last couple of years. I don't think he's been necessarily the issue. I mean, he's serviceable, top 20 QBR, completing more than 70% of his passes, 9.3 yards per attempt. It's been okay. They're actually leaning on Beck more than I expected. The Georgia pass offense, 300-plus yards in 3 of the 5 games. They've had at least 33 pass attempts in all 5. Obviously, Brock Bowers is the star. He was last week, generational player at tight end. That's not an exaggeration. That's not a hot take. He's been by far their top player playmaker, whether it be running back or receiver. Almost double the yardage of the next receiver. Highest EPA in college football among the Heisman contenders. Secretly, I'm hoping he is one because I have a nice price on him. I don't think he'll win it.
You guys are really pushing that narrative, by the way, for a guy who's outside the top 30 in the country in receiving yards and doesn't play a marquee game this year.
Wow. All right. Well done. Way to put me in my place there. But
Brad Payne's still still angry about the Heisman since Kyle Trask didn't get more serious consideration a couple of years ago.
Wow. I think, you mentioned it. I think a key return last week kind of can be Beck's safety valve. Ladd McConkey returned last week, had 4 catches, a guy that can move the chains for you when you're struggling a little bit. So I thought that was a key return that a lot of people probably overlooked a little bit there. Here's my issue. It's the offensive line, believe it or not. An offensive line that we thought might be the top offensive line in the country coming into the season, not getting consistent push. And in fact, I started to notice that against Ball State. They couldn't even top 100 rushing yards against a Ball State team. 4.4 yards per carry. That's the fewest for Georgia in more than a decade. The explosives aren't there. They're a little bit banged up. Payne's boy that he thought for sure was heading to Florida State, Amarius Mims, out indefinitely. They had to shuffle the offensive line a little bit. Ratledge and Van Pran, preseason All-American types, first-team All-Americans, they haven't really played up to that. So I'm really anxious to see. I think the matchup to watch is to see, if they can start performing to preseason expectations, because I'm here to tell you, the Kentucky defensive front has some guys. A couple of big bodies up front, including Deion Walker's 348 pounds, and Pro Football Focus has him as the number 5 defensive lineman in the country. The Kentucky run game, while they haven't played, a great slate, to say the least, of opposing offenses, they're at least doing their part. Top 10 in the country in rushing yards per game, top 10 in yards per carry allowed. The success rates and standard downs on standard downs and passing downs are both good for Kentucky. Trevin Wallace is a kid that's given them some at least some pass rush ability from the linebacker position, 3.5 sacks. He's a guy, if you followed his career, former track star, can really run. Maxwell Harrison, I mentioned the Vanderbilt game. He was the guy that had the 2 pick sixes. Not only does he have that, but he leads the team in tackles, so he's playing like an All-American. But with that being said, Kentucky's given up some explosives in the pass game, again, against a questionable slate. 3rd and 4th down success rates, number 85 in the country. I'm still not here pounding on the table thinking that this Kentucky defense is everything that they've looked as far as the numbers say so far. So I do think there's some opportunities here for Georgia to have some success, and I'm really intrigued to see that the line of scrimmage battle, to see who can win that one, because I'm here to tell you, I was a little shocked that Georgia didn't get more push against Auburn on both sides, to be honest with you.
Yeah, look, Auburn pushed them. There is no doubt about it. That game was tight from start to finish. It was a Herculean effort for, one player to get Georgia across the finish line with that 27-20 victory, a decision that appeared to be in peril for extended stretches as far as Georgia's winning streak was concerned. So it'll be interesting to see if Kentucky can move into that upper echelon, or we get vintage Georgia in this particular spot, knowing that this will mark the midway point of the season, and eventually you have to believe a team is what they tell you they are, and Georgia right now has been rather middling despite being the preseason favorite to repeat as national champions. We'll stay in the Bluegrass State, guys, and it's a big day obviously for college football in Kentucky. The Wildcats on the road in Athens, but it's Louisville playing host to the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. And we're looking at Notre Dame, a 6.5-point road favorite, total up a touch from where it opened into that 54.5 range. And this will be the first meeting between the schools as ranked teams. Last week, Louisville announced its game against Notre Dame was sold out. It'll be the Cardinals' first time selling out the stadium since they last hosted Notre Dame in 2019, but since then they've increased capacity. So this will be an electric atmosphere, to say the least. Louisville 5-0 for the first time since 2013, since Teddy Bridgewater was the starting quarterback. When you go back and look at how they performed in that campaign, it was a 12-1 record overall, and they're seeking their 8th straight win at home. They haven't won 8 straight home games since winning 9 in a row in 2015 to 2016. But instead, an Irish team that's won 30 straight regular season games versus ACC teams. Last loss coming back in 2017 at number 7 Miami. And they've also covered 10 straight during that particular span. They've won 15 consecutive road games against ACC SEC teams, 12 of those 15 wins by 10-plus points. Last week against Duke notwithstanding, but they did get that extremely valuable 2-point conversion to get outside the number with a touchdown victory. But Brad, when we look at the Irish, I mean, this schedule has done them no favors. They played back-to-back games that were decided in the final 30 seconds with the near miss against Ohio State at home. They're able to get on the right side of that coin flip decision with that Audric Estime run against Duke. They go on the road, play under the lights at Louisville. They have USC on deck, and they actually played a week 0 game where they had to travel internationally to take on Navy. When you look at all of those factors, before we even get into the X's and O's, how do you begin to factor that into trying to come up with a number and your confidence level that the Irish just aren't running on empty?
Well, I mean, it's one of the factors of this game because not only playing a 7th straight game, you mentioned the travel to Europe, back-to-back games that went all the way to the wire, very physical games. You look at the snap counts for some of their key players. They didn't rotate a lot of people like they did early in the first 4 games of the season. Last 2 games, the starters are basically played for Notre Dame on almost every snap, especially up front on defense. So it's a major concern. I mean, being a former Notre Dame fan that follows the program very closely since I, took off that hat after the Ohio State game. I mean, honestly, I would fire I'm so glad the athletic director is retiring because it's just unacceptable. I mean, this schedule, whether it catches up with them this week or next week, which I think will be the case against SC, I mean, you're basically scheduling yourself out of the playoffs because of a ridiculous schedule.
Join a conference.
They basically are in the ACC conference. You know what? I don't want to get off on a tangent.
No tangent. Go ahead. Take the opportunity. Go off on a tangent.
I'm messing with you.
No. He made an off comment, and it kind of stuck with me the last couple of weeks about ACC officiating. You questioned it the Florida State Clemson game. I started paying attention to it. It's bad. Like it was, Notre Dame had a lot of pre-snap penalties that were obviously deservedly called, but there was 3-4 penalties there that were questionable to say the least against Duke. And I was watching some of the other conference games. Leaves a lot to be desired, ACC officiating. I'll put it at that. Back to this game. Where are we seeing, that maybe the impact on, playing all these games in a row? We certainly saw it last week, and I think one of the other key factors is the Notre Dame health at wide receiver. I'm not sure that people I can tell you there was a certain group that bet the over in the game. I couldn't believe it because Notre Dame was so compromised at wide receiver. It was already the biggest concern on the team heading into the season. They really were only going to go 7 deep. That was the plan coming into it. If you look from the snap counts and the grades from the season opener against Navy, they were missing 4 of those top 5 wide receivers from the opener last week. So they were starting a true freshman, a converted running back, and a sophomore that, I don't think it's ever going to happen for him. His head is not consistently in the game. So it was a dire situation, to say the least, last week against Duke for wide receiver at Notre Dame. Thankfully, tight end Mitchell Evans stepped up, played like an All-American, quite frankly, the last 2 weeks against the Buckeyes and Duke. And for this particular game, Notre Dame gets back their top 2 receivers, Jaden Greathouse, Jaden Thomas back. I think that certainly helps them out here as far as balance on offense. I will say this on the other side, though, that I know Louisville is going to be hyped up. This goes back to one of your first questions on this week's show. When you start connecting the dots on Louisville, I know they're 5-0, but not impressed. Huge rally against Georgia Tech in the opener. Doesn't look good when Georgia Tech's losing to BG last week. Goal line stand to hold on to beat Indiana by 7. Hoosiers go out, almost lose, should have lost to Akron, destroyed by Maryland, fired their offensive coordinator last week. Last week, down 10-0 at NC State. Armstrong has a couple of brain farts, overthrows a pass on that opening third quarter possession that probably would have iced the game, to be honest with you. And then obviously Armstrong's benched there. So I really seriously question Louisville's strength of schedule so far.
It's a fair assessment. And look, I mean, you talk about connecting the dots and data points. We have one common opponent for Louisville and Notre Dame. Notre Dame ends up taking care of business in a game that felt like it was delayed 37 times. At Carter Finley Stadium against NC State, winning 45-24. Louisville offensively couldn't really do much as the Wolfpack held them to a season-low 20 rushing yards and needed that late field goal to escape 13-10 despite some of those struggles. The last question on this game, Brad, I'll ask you, is about Louisville's offense. I mean, Jack Plummer in a unique spot, something that we may never see again, although I shouldn't say that, with college football in the transfer portal. He'll play Notre Dame for the third straight season wearing a third different jersey. This time, though, Plummer at least gets the game at home. Louisville does have some weapons. Is there a path for the Cardinal to have a little bit of success offensively, knowing that they're very much like Kentucky in the capacity that down to down they haven't been great, but they do have that explosive big play potential in their arsenal?
So I mentioned Notre Dame being tired legs on the defense, have played a lot of snaps. So how can you take advantage of it? Through explosives. Well, Louisville has a couple players that are super explosive. Jamari Thrash, a transfer, over 20 yards per catch. Really impressive player so far. And then at the running back position, Jordan, again, maybe not consistent on a down-to-down basis, but he has the big playability, 7.7 yards per carry for him. So, yeah, that's the goal would be here. I don't think they can move it methodically against this Notre Dame defense, but hit a couple of explosives and then maybe take advantage of a Notre Dame offense that's shown some warts here the last couple of weeks and a play caller that was questioned to begin with as far as the hire goes for Notre Dame. Maybe take advantage of him not being so well. You hit a couple explosives on offense. You got the crowd in the game. You go into the fourth quarter where anything can happen.
Hey, it's a lot to think about. Obviously, it's trying to quantify the situational component that'll work in Louisville's favor, but sometimes you do need the Jimmies and Joes to get you over the hump. And Payne, you don't get to comment when we have an expert, a former Notre Dame fan with an unbiased opinion of the Fighting Irish, to break it down. We're just going to move on to the next game and allow things to kick off with the Red River rivalry, guys, where Oklahoma and Texas will start the day in style on Saturday, an 11 o'clock central kickoff from the Cotton Bowl at the Texas State Fair. And it's the Longhorns, a 6.5-point favorite in the game, total of 60.5. It's the 119th meeting in this border war, the first time the teams will meet as undefeated sides since 2011. Texas pasted Oklahoma 49-0 last season in a game where Dylan Gabriel didn't play, and Oklahoma tried to employ the Wildcat offense with very little success. Jaden Gibson on last year's blowout, they tried to take our pride from us last year. They said that we were sorry, we were not OU. I'm not here for any of that this time around. Texas 5-0 for the first time since 2009. They went to the BCS championship game and lost to Bama in that particular season. They were able to create a bit of history last week against Kansas. They had a 300-yard passer in Quinn Ewers, a 200-yard rusher in Jonathan Brooks, and a 100-yard receiver in Adonai Mitchell in the same game for the second time in school history. Meanwhile, Oklahoma, it looked like they were going to go down to the wire with Iowa State, but they were able to find some separation. Went on a 29-0 run to close out the game, allowed just 80 yards in the second half after allowing nearly 30 in the first half. When we begin to break this game down, Payne, and we talk about the Oklahoma offense, 40 points in the first half against Iowa State was the first time doing so against a conference opponent since 2020. Dylan Gabriel seems to be in full command of leading Jeff Lebby's offense, a completion percentage better than 75, 300-plus passing yards, 19 touchdowns, and just 2 picks. But you look at Oklahoma's schedule, and this will clearly be a step up in class when you're talking about the Longhorns defensive line and everything else that comes along with it. Do we have an accurate assessment of what OU is offensively, at least through the first 5 games they've played this season?
I think so. And I think they are struggling to be multidimensional. Dylan Gabriel's a little bit more of a threat to run this season. You can see that implemented in his game just because they feel confident in the backup quarterback. So Levy's dialed that up a little bit more, but it's been needed to provide some balance because Oklahoma's run offense is wildly below average when you look at Power 5 teams and opponent-adjusted EPA per play. So to me, this is very much about Oklahoma's pass game. And when you factor an opponent, I actually think the Sooners' schedule's right. Cincinnati it's a solid defense, right? SMU, solid defense. So when you factor in opponent, the passing offense for Oklahoma on an EPA per play basis is better than both Washington and USC through 5 weeks. I think part of the rushing issues Oklahoma is having is obviously up front. They're not creating much push. Oklahoma's outside the top 100 in offensive line yards created, and you look at Texas, top 15 in defensive line yards. So a little bit of a mismatch there with Devondre Sweat in the middle and Jalen Ford kind of playing that thumper role in the middle of the field. And you look at Ford, missed 2 tackles all season. So he's just really been that solidifying force at linebacker. I think maybe where there's a couple things that Oklahoma does that maybe presents some challenges for the Longhorns defense. I think the first is pace. Think about who Texas has played this season. It's been absolute snails in Kansas and Wyoming and Rice and Alabama. Those 4 offenses average out to be well outside the top 100 in plays per minute. Now you get, Jeff Lebby's offense that wants to move fast, and I think that's important to think about, right, when the Longhorns' best defender is 365 pounds. It's tough to project this, but the key to stopping Oklahoma, if you've watched, is doing it on the first 3 downs or the second 3 downs, not allowing OU to get in their tempo where they can wear you down and finally score on the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th play. SMU's defense did a good job early against Oklahoma with that. Cincinnati did a fantastic job. OU went 3 and out on a third of their possessions. I think the other kind of 2 factors worth mentioning is yes, this is the best defense Texas has had in the Sark era. And you think about Pete Kwiatkowski's defense, how it was designed and built. It was to stop these spread passing attacks. But Texas has given up some explosive plays this season. They're actually outside the top 70 in explosive pass percentage allowed. And then from a quarterback perspective as well, this is actually a step up in class for Texas. You look at the last 3 weeks, the Longhorns defense has faced 3 backup quarterbacks. Now, I know it's not massive downgrades for Wyoming, Baylor, or Kansas from the starter to backup, but none of those teams had the guy they wanted under center. So I'm not quite sure if Oklahoma's offense is balanced enough, and obviously Texas' defense is built to stop the spread, but from a pace perspective, from a quarterback perspective, this is also a step up in class for Texas.
It's a great point. I mean, clearly Kansas had a scramble the morning of the game last week. We know Kansas took professional money, and I think a lot of people were stunned when they saw Jason Bean out there warming up.
You think?
that offensive game plan never really got going, and when you watch that contest, clearly accuracy-wise it was off. They couldn't get much, and it was Texas actually being able to do what they wanted against the Kansas defense. But yeah, Brad, I didn't see that coming a mile away. Jalen Daniels apparently still dealing with that balky back that kept him out of their season opener. We'll see if he's able to go this week against UCF. On the other side, when we look at Texas offensively, 5 straight games with 30-plus points, the longest such streak since doing it 6 times in a row back in 2019 to 2020. They've had issues that they've been, pretty vocal about trying to get corrected in 3rd and short situations of 0 to 3 yards, tied for the 2nd worst mark in the nation. They haven't been great on 3rd downs and converting. You figure there's going to be a little bit of regression in that regard, but Quinn Ewers always becomes the X factor, and we haven't seen necessarily vintage Quinn other than for stretches against Alabama. But Brad, a game I come back to that, we laid the points with Texas against TCU a season ago, and TCU confused them from start to finish. Oklahoma may not have some of the same dudes on that side, but they do have a very good defensive mind in Brent Venables, who could potentially try and bring blitzes from a variety of angles, but you wonder how Oklahoma holds up on the back end. When you look at Texas's offense against Oklahoma's defense, do you see a path to success for either one of these units?
Probably more on the Texas side, although there's certainly some questions that they're going to have to be answered. Quinn Ewers, the good thing that we've seen so far this season, Payne mentioned it last week, only 1 turnover-worthy play heading into last week. Did have a few, though, last week, including his first interception in 246 pass attempts, ending the 2nd longest streak in school history. I worry anytime I start seeing a couple of bad throws. Does he regress like what happened post Oklahoma last year? So I have a worry there, and the other worry is the health status of tight end Jatavian Sanders. If you watch Texas football the last couple of years, I mean, this guy really opens up the playbook for Sark. I would say a prototypical tight end as far as inline blocking, but man, in the receiving game, as good as anybody in the country. He hurt his ankle last week. We'll know more Thursday. He's day-to-day right now. We'll see. He's a guy that, in my opinion, might be worth a half a point. That's how much I think of Sanders. One thing, and again, I go back to because we broke down Texas last week, Payne was mentioning Sark wanting to be more versatile, more balanced, especially in the run game last week. Well, they got that. Jonathan Brooks started to look like the feature back they can count on. Certainly never going to be a Bijan Robinson type player, but he was good enough last week. I mean, 217 yards, 6 missed tackles forced, 111 yards after contact. Now, you know, when you have a game like that, the season counting stats start looking a little bit better. Run blocking, though, for the season's been average. Pro Football Focus has him at number 69, run blocking. The offensive rush success rate, number 83. There's been some concerns, and they'll certainly get tested against this OU front. Another thing that I thought was peculiar last week, as soon as Sanders went out of the lineup, Mitchell, the Georgia transfer, I mean, he's been featured a little bit, but it's been more consistent. You know, he'll get his 3 catches like he had in each of the first 4 games. As soon as Sanders was out, Mitchell became almost like the featured receiver, the featured weapon of this offense. 10 receptions last week, so keep an eye on that. Jonte Cook, the outstanding 5-star freshman, was also featured more. So if you're into fantasy, keep an eye on that if Sanders gets ruled out. I will say, I thought Texas was much more dominant than that final indicated last week. It should have been a 40-plus point win. I mean, they crushed Kansas big time. And I think it kind of leads, and I'll talk Oklahoma defense here in a second, but it worries me a little bit. Some of the they probably should have even been more dominant against Baylor the week before. In a close game, and this is, you know, priced a touchdown or less. The special teams for Texas, 2 subpar games in a row, fumbles on returns, 5 missed kicks already. So that would be a concern for me. On the other side, certainly the Oklahoma defense much improved this year. I mean, basic counting stats. I mean, you don't have to be Einstein to figure some of this out. I mean, 19 points per game less, 142 yards per game less. Even against some questionable competition, you can just see it. You use your eyes. They're much improved. You can tell the communication's much better. There's a lot less breakdowns than what they had last year. Danny Stutzman's all over the field at linebacker. He's got 27 more tackles than the number 2 player all over the field. I like saddens me to say this, but man, Peyton Bowen's living up to his 5-star ability. 2 block punts. Again, I mentioned the special teams there. He's 4th in tackles. Billy Bowman making plays in the secondary. I will also say this, though. Watching Oklahoma in preparation for this podcast, you would think a team that's unbeaten. Unbeaten not only straight up, but unbeaten against the spread. I was expecting to see total domination rewatching some of these games. I did not see that. 45 minutes into the SMU game. Pretty even game. Cincy game much closer than a final. Who would have thought Cincinnati struggling in the red zone like they have all year? That game might have been a little bit different. Last week, even the Iowa State game, I know it looks great, the final, but they get Oklahoma gets a pick 6 on the first play of the game. And then I thought for the next 25 minutes, Iowa State outplayed them. They hit a bunch of explosives in the pass game. Oklahoma got that block punt safety that started to turn the tide in that game. So for a team that's sitting here at 5-0 against the spread, I'm not seeing total. I saw total domination against Arkansas State and Tulsa, but the other 3 games against a little bit better competition, I'm not seeing it on a consistent basis.
Yeah, it sounds so dumb to say because obviously we're all trained to be analytically inclined. The eye test only is one small part of it, but you watch Oklahoma on both sides of the ball and nothing pops for me. You watch Texas and you see the difference makers and some of the explosive big play potential that's there, where Oklahoma, to their credit, they've gone out there, they've executed a game plan, they've exceeded odds makers' expectations, but they don't pop on film when you watch them for stretches and you try and figure out, okay, is it just me? Is there something else going on here? I guess we're going to get a pretty good indication in Dallas on Saturday exactly how good Oklahoma is, a team that at least on paper appears to be the only legitimate threat in the Big 12 to Texas as far as conference supremacy this upcoming season. From the Big 12, though, guys, we'll head to the Big 10. It's another early kickoff, this time in Columbus, Ohio, where it's the Buckeyes, fresh off of a bye week, welcoming in an undefeated Maryland side, and Ohio State has taken money in the betting market early on this week. They're now up to a 20-point favorite, total on the game 58. And when you look at the Buckeyes, they've won all 8 meetings between these programs, winning by an average of nearly 5 touchdowns a contest. They've hung 43+ on the Terrapins in all of those games. Meanwhile, Maryland 5-0 for the first time since 2001. Won the first 5 games by 15+ points each for the first time in school history. They're the only undefeated Power 5 team not ranked this week and haven't actually entered the AP poll since 2019. Turnover margin of +9, second in the country behind Penn State at +11. But when you look at Maryland, and we talked about this at the top of the show, you wonder if they faced a living, breathing, capable offense in any capacity so far this season. Meanwhile, Ryan Day has gotten his Buckeyes to play at their best, especially coming off a bye. We don't have a massive sample size, but you do have 6 data points. Average margin of victory for the Buckeyes with a week to prepare in conference, 41 points in 6 such games. And you look at Ohio State, these games have consistently gone over the total. Ohio State plenty to focus on in their bye week. So Brad, when we begin to look at Maryland offensively, this is a group that's benefited immensely from starting field position. Basically at their own 35-yard line, 7th in field position allowed, so giving them a plus 10 net yardage advantage every series they start. And while they have gone out there and put up crooked numbers, you look at the defensive ranks of the opponents they faced. Charlotte outside the top 100, Virginia fringe inside the top 100, Indiana outside the top 100, and Michigan State a far cry from where they've been. But Talia Tagovailoa gives them a puncher's chance more often than not, especially with a number this big, and there are some weapons to like wearing Maryland colors.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the short fields. That popped to me last week watching the Indiana tape. This offense benefited greatly from a bunch of short fields last week. And then I go back to some of the earlier games this season. I see some inconsistencies. Slow starts against Charlotte and Virginia, a bad second half against Michigan State. I also go back to the spring game, and Mike Loxley had the comment about his offense, at least to start that game. It was like watching paint dry. So, the counting stats look good. The end results, but man, I don't see when you can't be consistent on a possession in and out basis against the schedule that they played so far. I don't know if you're going to get consistency against this Ohio State defense. So I still think there's some major questions to be answered as far as Josh Gaddis as OC and how well it's gone or not. Maybe reality starts settling in for this Maryland offense this week.
Just ask Miami fans how thrilled they are that Josh Gaddis isn't down there in Coral Gables this season.
Yeah, but you mentioned the weapons, and I'll say this. Again, going back to the spring game, I mean, one of my biggest takeaways was, wow, at least from skill position and some of the guys on the perimeter, Maryland is the 4th most talented team in the Big Ten. I mean, behind, obviously, the big 3, Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State. But, I mean, they do have some legitimate weapons. They have 3 experienced running backs, top 3 rushers last year, top 3 this year, led by Hemby. They got 4 receivers, a lot of balance, 18 or more catches this year, 200-plus yards, all 4 of them. Tight end Dyches is there. Jason Jones, their top guy. Felton was the guy that really popped on tape last week for me. Offensive line was the question mark coming into the season. I'm not sure they've been tested like they will get this week. Run blocking has been the offense's biggest weakness. I know their tackle Glaze has been playing well. But let's talk about the test, because this is the Buckeyes' best defense since the 2019 team. Not even a question. Even though we got a small sample size, I'm safely can say that. Obviously, Steele Chambers and Eichenberg at linebacker lead the way as far as the counting stats. I like Williams at defensive tackle. Jack Sawyer and JTT haven't gotten to the quarterback, but they've gotten a little bit of pressure. Denzel Burke has played well. You haven't heard his name called too much because they're avoiding him. They're actually going to they're throwing at the opposite side on the Ole Miss transfer. I will say this, though. I'm not sure that Maryland's the team that takes advantage of them this week. But I was stunned that Notre Dame, contrary to Ryan Day and his beef with Lou Holtz, I kind of agreed with Lou Holtz post game, even though Ohio State got the win. Ohio State was pushed around again in a big time game against Notre Dame's offensive line. Gave up over 175 rushing yards, 4.5 yards per carry, and with a Notre Dame team that was, kind of playing one dimensional to their own, because that's what they wanted to do. They didn't try to throw it. They still lined it up in the second half and went right at Ohio State. So I still have some a little bit concerns there. I'm just not sure Maryland's the type of team that's going to be able to take advantage of it.
You mentioned it, Brad, and I thought that was interesting reading some of the comments from Ohio State's defensive coordinator, Jim Knowles, throughout the course of the week. He pretty much called out his veteran linebacking group in Tommy Eichenberg and Steele Chambers and called them they basically saying they can play better, and they both know it, given what he saw against Notre Dame, who was able to impose their will physically. And you wonder if that isn't a call to action and a chance to really feast on an opponent. To your point that we have some major question marks about their offensive line and their ability to protect their starting quarterback. But Payne, if Ohio State's going to have success where it matters most at the betting window and win this game by margin, they're going to need their offense to hum on all cylinders. And the win over Notre Dame snapped an FBS record streak of 77 straight 20-point games, the fewest points in any game for the Scarlet and Gray, going back to 2017 versus number 5 Oklahoma, where they lost 31-16. Kyle McCord yet to throw a passing touchdown in 2 games versus Power 5 opponents this season. The season opener against Indiana, the game against Notre Dame, the common denominator there, both of those games were indeed on the road, so a little bit more favorable when you're playing at home. But this is a Buckeyes offense that we've grown accustomed to, putting up crooked numbers with NFL caliber talent wherever you look. Matched up against the Maryland defense that could feel this as a little bit of a jolt to the system, that can't stop the run, you begin to wonder, do the Buckeyes even have to throw all that frequently, or will this be a game where they can churn out 7-8 yards per carry with a very deep stable of running backs?
Yes, and yes. I think you hit everything perfectly. I mean, Ohio State's offense is stepping down in class going from Notre Dame to Maryland, and Maryland is taking a massive step up. It's very much the same thing Brad said on the other side with the schedule. By our numbers, Maryland hasn't faced a top 90 schedule-adjusted offense yet this season. You're looking at FCS Towson, Charlotte, Virginia, Michigan State, and Indiana. The 4 FBS offenses Maryland has played have an average efficiency rank of 111th in the country. And now Ryan Day has 2 weeks to prepare for a Maryland defense that, for me, has issues along the defensive front. You look at the last 3 games where Maryland's had sizable leads against Virginia, Sparty, and Indiana. They won those 3 games by an average of roughly 26 points. And so that's a spot where defensive linemen love to be, right? They get to pin their ears back, rack up stats, get after the quarterback in these known passing situations without a threat of run, yet Maryland's pressure rate is 30% over the last 3 games. Then you look specifically at the defensive front against the run, which was your main question there. The Terps are outside the top 90 in defensive line yards allowed, outside the top 100 in both rushing success rate allowed and stuff rate. So this is a game where, that 3-headed monster of Travion Henderson and Chip Trainum and Mayan Williams all gets fired up. If you can run on Maryland, and I think all signs point to that being the case, I think this leads to some positive red zone regression, and that's an area where Ohio State hasn't been great, only scoring touchdowns on 54% of trips inside the 20. So I think Kyle McCord probably gets a passing touchdown or 2. And we all know now with data and analytics that you don't need a great ground game to fire up play action. But I think in the minds of coaches, it helps. And Maryland has been good preventing big plays, but again, against the Sisters of the Blind there on offense. So I think when Ohio State gets that ground game going, Kyle McCord has done very well throwing with play action. If you look, his adjusted accuracy, 6 points better throwing with play action. Big time throw rate is over 12% with play action. Marvin Harrison Jr. seems all systems are a go after that injury scare against Notre Dame. I could see some timely explosives off play action. And I think if you just kind of remember back to what I said in the offseason about this Ohio State offense, I was kind of down on it relative to market. But this specific game, there's some really nice matchups on this side of the ball that I think lead Ohio State to having some offensive success.
It's pretty wild when you look at just the counting stats of the opposition that Maryland has faced this year. Towson, an FCS opponent in their opener, but they haven't faced a team that's shown balance. You play Charlotte, who's 106th in the country in passing, 98th in rushing. Virginia, 48th in the country in passing, but offers zero threat of a ground game, 123rd in that department. Michigan State, probably the most complete team, and I use that term relatively facetiously, 60th in passing, outside the top 100 in rushing. And then Indiana last week, as Brad mentioned, fires their offensive coordinator in Walt Bell, 101st in passing, 119th in rushing. So if Maryland's going to pick their poison here, they're going to have to figure it out because the Buckeyes will try and beat them on the ground and through the air in this particular spot with 2 weeks to sell self-scout, reevaluate, and figure out who they're going to be for the next 8 regular season games. You can
how Walt Bell was ever hired after what he did at Florida State is beyond me. One of the more head-scratching hires, because he was a horrific OC at Florida State who I thought was going to be fired, and then UMass was like, give me all of that. So I was surprised by that, and then Indiana decided to hire him as well. It was wildly bizarre, his career path after, I thought, flaming out at Florida State.
The trajectory of college coaches is always fascinating, to say the least, to see guys that haven't performed at one program and everybody else thinks they can be a fixer-upper and get the most out of them in some capacity or another, which has left me scratching my head. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me on social media. Most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And if you haven't already done so, subscribe to the Bet the Board podcast newsletter delivered right to your inbox, absolutely free, every single Friday throughout this football season. And gentlemen, it's time for us to make our weekly divergence away from big boy football. This week, our travels will take us to the lovely hamlet of Logan, Utah, where Utah State will welcome in Colorado State in Mountain West play. And we've seen a major move on the side from where this number opened, at least from one prominent shop out here in the desert. Colorado State, a modest road favorite in that 2-point range, a total in the low 60s, 63.5, 64. And Brad, when we look at Colorado State, they went through the motions last week against Utah Tech. Didn't have to obviously empty the playbook, but they've at least found a starting quarterback that they can lean on in Fowler Nicolosi. Meanwhile, on the other side, Utah State travels across the country to Stores. They look like they're sleepwalking early, need a blocked extra point. They escape with a narrow 34-33 win against the Huskies, but they've seen a change in quarterback multiple times. McKay Hillstead stepped in, gave them a puncher's chance, but it was Cooper Lagasse, the incumbent starter from last year, that bailed him out. When you look at this game for both teams, knowing that it's a new lease on life, so to speak, in conference play, what's the angle that you feel is most intriguing to try and attack?
Yeah, we're going to go with the total. I don't give out many totals, but we're going to go over the total here, over the 63.5. Multitude of reasons why I think there's some value here, and I'm not a big guy that likes to play over the totals in the 60 range, but both teams run tempo. You got to have that in today's day and age. Colorado State, number 12 in plays per minute. Utah State, number 7. I also think you mentioned that the big move as far as the side goes. I just think the market thinks the factor of Utah State, the Hillstead kid out, thinking it's being some major factor. I don't think that's the case. In fact, Lagasse has more experience. You mentioned bailing him out last week. Yeah, he came off the bench, threw 3 touchdowns last week. And he got benched against Air Force. I mean, he's still on the season completing 70% of his passes, had an 87 QBR last week, had some experience from last year. So I don't think it's that much of a downgrade, if any at all, as far as the Colorado State quarterback situation goes. But more importantly, why I think there's some value, I don't think the totals market has gotten a grasp on Utah State totals this year. Last 4 games, they have went over by an average of 26.5 points per game. And they were playing slow-tempo teams. Now they're playing a fast-tempo team. I mean, when you played Iowa, Air Force, James Madison, Connecticut, and you're still seeing some super high-scoring games, I'm not sure that the market has a grasp here on this Utah State program that even coming into the season, you had to almost mark yourself as an over type of team, because Anderson, the head coach, taking over the play calling duties, and then defensively lost pretty much everybody. And if you don't believe me, 3 of the best players are starting on Big 12 teams right now and performing well. So I just think until the market settles in and gets a grasp on this Utah State team as far as the total goes, I'm finding value in the over here. And Colorado State kind of an over team as well. Again, a team that's got plenty of weapons on offense and humming, with Horton, probably the best wide receiver in the Mountain West, a tight end from BYU. We saw him show up consistently. So a lot of weapons here for a total, and a lot of tempo for a total that, sitting in the low 60s, probably should be in the high 60s in my opinion.
This group in in Fort Collins right now, a lot more similar to Jay Norvell DNA that we grew accustomed to in Nevada than what we saw last year, where Colorado State couldn't get out of their own way offensively. And to your point, Brad, I think it was, astute to mention the fact that, hey, look, both these teams are playing fast. I mean, it's not like Colorado State's out there trying to slow games down like we saw last year, knowing that they just wanted to try and limit possessions because they didn't have some of the firepower. So track meet expected in Mountain West play in Logan between Colorado State and Utah State. And a game, guys, that may see some points on the board could take place at the Rose Bowl this weekend, where Washington State and UCLA both come into this matchup well rested. It's the Bruins, a 3.5-point home favorite, total on the game 59. First meeting between these schools since UCLA went up to Pullman back in 2019 and won a true track meet, 67-63. It's the first trip to Pasadena for Washington State since 2015. And when we look at Washington State, they're seeking their first 5-0 start since the 2017 season. They've won 3 straight on the road, have not won 4 straight on the highway since 2002, and looking to start Pac-12 play 2-0 for the first time since 2017. Meanwhile, UCLA, they've lost 3 straight and 7 of their last 9 versus ranked Pac-12 teams. The last win, 2022 versus number 11 Utah. And Payne, when we look at Washington State offensively, I think all of us knew what Cam Ward could be. We hadn't seen him put it all together quite like he has so far this season under his new offensive coordinator, and it's really paying dividends. I mean, this is a group that kind of plodded along on offense last year that has really ramped things up. They're creating explosive plays at a high rate, and Cam Ward, of course, is the catalyst behind that, as he's 10th in completion percentage, 3rd in yards per game, 8th in passing efficiency. But he'll be matched up against a UCLA defense that I think we're all still trying to figure out exactly what they are going to be, because while the counting stats are good, the efficiency numbers are tremendous, they haven't played an offense, quite frankly, that is living, breathing, or one that has a pulse in their first 4 games of the season.
Very early two-way action this week. It feels like a little bit of a battle, right? Laying 3 with UCLA, taking 4 on Wazoo. We're going to have a better idea of what the stronger position is as limits increase. But my initial vibe on why that difference of opinion is the same as what you just intimated. What is your belief in UCLA's defense? And I think that's the wide-ranging difference of opinion among pro bettors. And we can all read the quotes and hear the positivity from players about, D'Anton Lynn, the new defensive coordinator for UCLA, and the raw surface level counting stats look fantastic through, a couple data points relative to what the Bruins have been defensively in the Chip Kella era. But they haven't played anybody. I mean, Utah and San Diego State are both outside the top 115 in EPA per pass, right? And so then you throw in FCS North Carolina Central. They're not a threat. And really the best offense to date that UCLA's faced is Tim Beck's offense. And that's not really a mind that we respect, but Coastal Carolina is the one semi-competent offense. And again, being like nice in my assessment, like that's it. And the Bruins allowed 50% success rate the first 3 quarters against Coastal Carolina. So this is really a massive step up in class against Cam Ward and Wazoo. And, you start to read some of the player quotes this week. I kind of get the vibe that UCLA is going to show light boxes as much as they can to try to dictate and lure Wazoo into running more than they want. Yep. And then some of the players have also talked about creating pressure to force Wazoo into handing it off more. It's great in theory, but when Cam Ward plays within structure, right, and he's kept clean, he's releasing the ball in under 2.1 seconds. It makes it virtually impossible to get to him. And the dichotomy between Wazoo's efficiency through the air and on the ground, I don't think with 2 weeks to prepare, Ben Arbuckle is going to be short-sighted and go with the least efficient option. So I think Wazoo is going to be pretty comfortable here. If you look like their schedule adjusted offense, it's top 10 in passing, but outside the top 70 in rushing. So I don't think they're going to kind of handicap themselves. The area of UCLA's defense that hasn't been tested yet is the secondary. Now I know 3 of 4 starters returned, but there was some questionable talent back there. It's still very clear that D'Anton Lynn's searching for his best 5 because he moved Jalen Davies into the starting corner role against Utah. Performed well against Utah, right? But it's Nate Johnson. He's not a threat to throw. So to me, this is about scheme, right? D'Anton Lynn was the secondary coach with the Texans, with the Ravens at the NFL level. He's got 2 weeks to come up with something to help his secondary. But I think if UCLA can lose the throw game on this side of the ball by a small margin or God, even create a stalemate, UCLA's got a really good chance to win and cover because they do have some advantages on the other side of the ball offensively.
Before we get to the other side, kind of want to get your take real quick since you're a much better talent evaluator than I am. When you watch Cam Ward, do you think his skill set translates to the next level?
It's a good question. Last year, I didn't necessarily think that was the case. The offense struggled mightily. He's got more weapons at his disposal this year, and it seems like when he came over, it was meshing with the former Incarnate Ward coach, right? And you're like, hey, this is going to kind of hit the ground running, but he's been much better with Arbuckle. The stature isn't great. I don't think the arm strength is great, but certainly his game lends itself more to the new era of football. I don't know on that front.
No, that's fair. I mean, it's just, something I think about when I look at the counterpart, obviously, that's not going to be out there this week for UCLA, but watching DTR make his starting debut last week for the Cleveland Browns, if the two of them have...
Not good.
No, yeah, if they have similar skill sets, and there is no doubt that was not good by any stretch of the imagination against the Baltimore Ravens. But you mentioned the other side of the ball, and Brad, when we look at UCLA offensively, I mean, look, there's no way to sugarcoat their performance against Utah. It turned out to be the absolute worst performance of the Chip Kelly era at UCLA, but we had reservations going into that game. When you throw a true freshman into that environment in what essentially amounted to his first road game, Dante Moore didn't get off to the best start, was intercepted early, and UCLA wasn't built to play from behind. I mean, they struggled to run the football and really get much of anything going. But at the same time, this is a matchup defensively. They're playing in friendly confines. Carson Steele and TJ Harden have shared the workload, and at least on paper, there appears to be a path for UCLA to run the football to open up some more opportunities in the air game. When we look at UCLA's offense against Washington State's defense, the Cougars have an ability to get after the passer, but they've really struggled down to down in terms of efficient ground games.
Yeah, certainly this matchup leads to, more success on the UCLA offensive side of things. Provided Dante Moore, rebounds as a freshman. Hopefully that performance against Utah didn't get him any yips or anything. Following his career, a pretty level-headed kid. I don't think that you'll see back-to-back repeat performances there, especially against this Washington State defense. You mentioned the Ball State transfer, Carson Steele and TJ Harden, pretty much splitting the carries. Both been explosive. Speaking of another transfer, their most impressive wide receiver is a Cal transfer in Sturdivant. He's been impressive as far as the explosives, 23.3 yards per catch. Pass blocking grade's not great, but it's not going to be great when one of your 4 data points is up against Utah's defense and you allow 7 sacks. The line yards per rush has been good. Pass success rate needs to be more consistent. As far as Moore, it's only number 94 in the country. So he can't have, when I expect Washington State's offense to have some success, he can't go through multiple possessions of a 3 and out or a bad throw or a missed open seam route like he had a couple of them against Utah. He's got to keep pace a little bit here. But I think he'll be able to do that because of all the units that we're going to talk about in today's podcast. Probably the least impressive one to me is Washington State's defense. Just the basic counting stats on a yards per play basis, number 85, not in the top 75 as far as yards per game. And it's not like they played tremendously great offenses. I mean, Wisconsin and Oregon State are fine. Maybe you can say good, but they're certainly not great. FCS opponent. Colorado State was meandering through the quarterback issues in that game. You mentioned that the 2 defensive ends, Ron Stone and Brennan Jackson, super experienced. They've been productive in their career. I actually expected a little bit more out of them this year. Tackling's been an issue. Oregon State really found the run game in the second half of that game in their last game. So I think there's certainly a pathway for UCLA's offense here to have a lot of success.
It's going to be interesting. It's a young kid, high expectations there, and when you face adversity, especially with extra time to prepare, you think that they're able to make market improvements. Again, we talk about self-scouting early in the year. Chip Kelly, an inventive offensive mind, should be able to run the football. A fascinating matchup that unfortunately about 9 people across this great country will be able to watch on the Pac-12 network Saturday afternoon. So I wish people best of luck. Hopefully those smoke signals and Telegram messages relay decent score updates that we can watch 72 hours after the game is completed. Final game of the weekend for us to break down on this very fine program in the SEC. and specifically with a team that suddenly has a new lease on life in the Alabama Crimson Tide, given the muddled mess that has become the SEC West this year. One of their biggest threats, maybe on paper, will be the team they're facing in the Texas A&M Aggies. And since we started recording this morning, gentlemen, we've seen a little bit of money come in on the underdog. 2.5s, dipping down to 2, as low as 1.5. The total hovering back and forth between 46.5 and 47. And Brad, I actually wanted to start this game with you before we get into both sides of the ball. Alabama clearly hasn't shown the big play potential. They went through their own quarterback saga before settling on Jalen Milroe. Defensively, it reminds us of a vintage Alabama team. Run the football, play defense, try and win games that way. Meanwhile, Texas A&M goes through a change in their own right. Connor Wegman hands the baton off to Max Johnson, but maybe more impressively for A&M, at least with a couple data points, the defensive line, loaded with 4- and 5-star recruits, has shown significantly better against opposing ground games, but we do have the blemish where they went on the road to South Florida to take on Miami and were absolutely gashed through the air. How have you adjusted the power rating for these two programs so far?
So Alabama certainly a downgrade, 3.5 points since the start of the season. Texas A&M flat, obviously was downgraded big time after the Miami performance, but heck, you gotta like what you saw the last couple weeks, especially when you start connecting data points. I mean, okay, you dominate Auburn's offensive front, and then you see Auburn's offensive front have success against Georgia's defensive line, so that actually aged pretty well in just a week's time. And then certainly last week, really shut down Arkansas's offense. That obviously moved up and down the field the week prior against, maybe everyone's going to move up and down the field against LSU, but still, that was a pretty good performance even last week. So the initial downgrade for A&M, they've gotten up to being flat as far as the power rating.
It's a fair way to look at it, and a game that obviously goes a long way this weekend. And Brad, I'll pivot right back to you. When we look at the matchup of Alabama's offense against A&M's defense, it's almost as though Alabama has taken on a run first, ask questions later mentality. They're top 3 amongst Power 5 teams in terms of their run percentage, toting the rock on more than 65% of their offensive snaps. But when you look at their offensive output, 32.2 points per game, it's actually the fewest for the Crimson Tide since 2009. The 195 passing yards per game is the fewest since 2017, where they had 193. The difference being back then in 2017, they were running the ball for 250 plus per game, a far cry from where they are, but at least trying to figure out their identity. We know what this team is going to be. Jalen Milroe, a little bit of familiarity against Texas A&M last year, and they're distributing carries. Last week, a little bit of an anomaly. Jermaine Burton logged just 9 snaps in the win versus Mississippi State, slightly head-scratching. But look, A&M has been able to get after the quarterback, and Alabama's protection hasn't been good. Is Alabama going to just go out there and run the ball 70% of the time to protect Milroe, or will they continue to hunt those explosives that plagued A&M against the Hurricanes?
Going to have to hit some explosives in this one in order to come out with a win. Last week was intriguing. I know the final looks pretty good, but my goodness, there was still a lot of inconsistencies and another slow start. So much that we saw vintage Saban on the sidelines last week with an epic tirade after, Alabama, looked out of sorts, to say the least, to start that game. Yeah, man, where do I start? Jalen Milroe obviously needs to be the quarterback here. Payne said it beautifully. He should have been the quarterback from the start. If you wanted to avoid the disaster season, you go ahead and you go with him at quarterback. At least he gives you some dynamics and explosives in the quarterback run game. Jace McClellan at running back looks like they want him to be the feature back now. He's starting to play a little bit better, but my goodness, the wide receiver core is such a far cry from what they had just 3-4 years ago, when it was arguably the best unit out of any unit in the country. Burton's their top guy, but it's tough to be your top guy, like you mentioned, when you're not playing snaps last week. I don't like the offensive line. I could argue that the Alabama offensive line is the biggest disappointment in college football this year. You mentioned the passing stats, the total yards, the points per game. Yeah, sure, you want to feature the run game this year because you question the quarterback play, but you can't get anything done in the run game. 168 yards, rushing yards per game, 4.1 yards per carry, second fewest since Nick Saban's first year. You mentioned they can't pass protect, 18 sacks in their last 4 games. They're number 122 in the country in sacks allowed. They're also allowing tackles for loss. Early downs, EPA number 89. I mean, this offense, I just don't see a pathway to success other than hitting a couple of explosives, which we even saw Alabama hit even against Texas in their one loss. Because you look on the other side, you're starting to see the young, talented freshmen up front on Texas A&M's defensive line starting to play up to their ability. Last week, only 174 yards allowed to Arkansas, 14 sacks the last 2 weeks. Dominated, like I mentioned, Auburn much worse than Georgia did. Edgerrin Cooper, he's actually their leading sacker from the linebacker position, playing like an All-American. He's their leading tackler. Walter Nolan's up there. Shamar Turner's getting some pressure. Tackling still is an issue for them. And then I still can't get Miami out of my head. So, Miami went up and down the field, the best offense they faced so far. So there is still that concern. But the trend line for Texas A&M's defense last couple of weeks has been really good. And I have still seen have yet to see Alabama's offense put a consistent 60-minute effort together.
You mentioned the game against Arkansas, and that was eye-opening. For anybody that watched that football game and just looks at the score, they go, oh, it's a workmanlike effort for A&M winning 36-22. But that was a hell of a lot more dominant than that scoreboard suggested for what A&M was able to do for long stretches and completely clamping down against KJ Jefferson, even if Arkansas was playing the game without a very talented tight end in Luke Haas, who was lost with a broken collarbone. And Payne, Brad mentioned pass protection, and when we talk about the other side of the ball, it is rinse and repeat here for an Aggies offense that is going to struggle immensely after allowing a pressure rate of 41.3%. In comes a Dallas Turner-led pass rush for Alabama, and Max Johnson doesn't have that same mobility in the pocket as Connor Wegman. You look at Johnson's numbers, 6 touchdowns to 1 interception. We know he's got the big arm, and he's got tons of playmakers, both at the running back position at the wide receiver spot. But if you're consistently under duress, going to make things extremely difficult to get the ball out to those guys and allow them to beat one-on-one coverage deep down the field.
Yeah, I mean, this game comes down to which team can protect, which team can have success on early downs because of the lack of protection that we have seen thus far for both. And, I mean, the reason Miami got steamed against A&M and the reason Miami ultimately won was because the Hurricanes pressured Connor Wegman on 51% of his dropbacks. And you just kind of look at what's going on there internally. A&M is kind of mixed and matched from left guard to right tackle throughout the course of this season. Truly, their only plus piece is the left tackle, Trey Zune. Now, if you've read some quotes and listened to some pressers, Jimbo believes the O-line is improving. He sees it in the film. I would say A&M's offensive line is marginally improving. If you look at some of the numbers, Connor Wegman was pressured on over 41% of his dropbacks. His throw time was 2.5 seconds on average. Max Johnson has been pressured on 39% of his dropbacks, but he holds on to the ball for 2.9 seconds, far longer than Wegman. So pressure rate slightly lower with a quarterback holding it longer, but it's not a strength by any measure. And I don't know if the sample size has been large enough to say, like, hey, the offensive line is truly improving. Now, metrically, Alabama hasn't been the dominant front they've been in years past, but if you look at Dallas Turner and Chris Braswell, they're trending a little bit better. I think Bama's defense in general is playing better despite the havoc rates and the defensive line yards allowed dipping. When you look at pressures and sacks, Kevin Steele's unit, without the number 3 pick in the draft, Will Anderson, is performing at and above last year's averages. Same exact pressure rates at about 20 per game, sacks per game are up. I look at the specific game against Ole Miss, who just hung 55 on LSU, and there's some real positive from Alabama's defensive front in that data point. 41% pressure rate on Jackson Dart, sacked him 5 times on all runs that weren't Jackson Dart. Alabama only allowed Ole Miss to rush for 3 yards before first contact on 17 running back carries. So they were able to stifle the ground game there. Texas A&M, kind of what we talked about at the top there, has been poor offensively on early downs, outside the top 75 in the country. If that continues, right, then Alabama can pin their ears back and get after Max Johnson in some known passing situations. The other interesting thing here is it looks like all signs point to Alabama linebacker Deontay Lawson missing this week again. Kevin Steele and Nick Saban moved Jahad Campbell inside at the backer position, and then Tresman Marshall took over as the defensive signal caller. And the reason I bring that up is, like, neither Campbell and Marshall are overly productive in coverage. Lawson was Alabama's best cover linebacker. So if I'm Petrino and Jimbo, Max Johnson's going to be on the move a little bit more. we're going to be upping the rate of play action. 22% isn't enough, and I'm putting Campbell and Lawson in conflict, especially on early downs in the RPO and play action throw game to kind of target Alabama's weakness and help with some of those early down issues. But I don't see A&M having a ton of sustained success drive to drive. They kind of have to piecemeal a couple drives together, but I think ultimately early downs are going to decide this game. I know Texas A&M's been getting whacked from open, right? As high as 4. We're now down to as low as 1.5. Like, let me kick this to you, Brad. Like, at what point does the price yield some value on Alabama?
Wow. I'm not there yet. I'm not sure I'm going to be there yet. I took some positions. Look, people have asked me, well, are you part of this A&M? And I wish I was a little bit at the start of the week, but I took a position in this game in the summer, and it's probably not going to bode well because it hasn't all year. But I don't think I'm looking to buy back at Alabama at this point. Maybe it'd have to get the pick, and I'm not sure it's ever going to get there. I agree as far as the line movement. I agree with the total. The only concern I would have as far as the under movement here, the only concern I would have would be quarterback turnovers because both of them scare the bejesus out of me as far as turning it over. So that would be under if I had to take a play now. But yeah, pick. I'd have a little bit of buyback on Alabama.
Yeah, I was wondering if we got to that point, and I know A&M's offense trending just a little bit better, right? But last week it's a defensive touchdown, it's a punt return touchdown from Smith that was magical. It wasn't just the offense that was putting up those points, and again I think it you hit it perfectly. It comes down to some of the early down stuff. I think if Alabama has the right plan in place, like offensively, I just, Todd, to your point, like I keep coming back to that Miami throw game, and I understand that Jalen Milroe isn't going to be able to do it methodically, but again, he can hit the explosive play from time to time, and that makes me a little bit nervous. If you look at Jalen Milroe, 22% of his throws this year are 20-plus yards. He's got a 148 passer rating on those throws, wow. 11 for 17. 4 of the 6 incompletions are drops. I mean, he has been amazing just launching it deep, and so that just kind of makes me nervous here in taking Texas A&M at this current price, although it very sharp at this point in the week.
It almost makes you wonder if you're A&M, you just play a too high safety shell of sorts, and you go, all right, if Milroe's going to beat us, he's going to have to do it in the intermediate passing game because he's not going to slice and dice, to your point, the same way that Tyler Van Dyke was able to, whereas if A&M dropped guys deep, Van Dyke could take what they were giving him underneath, but instead look for the vertical shots that were there early and often in that dominant performance.
Do you trust A&M's coaching staff to identify that simple thing?
Brad, given what I've seen from DJ Durkin so far, no, I absolutely do not trust him in the least to be able to get a Tiger to change its stripes in this particular spot. So it'll be interesting to see how they go about trying to approach it, because if they believe in their defensive line and their ability to generate pressure, and that group is coming of age, to your point, talking about Alabama's struggles in the trenches, that you may not need to commit extra defenders into stopping the run and play with 8 guys in the box with your defensive backs on an island. But that remains the greatest question with the Aggies coaching staff. The blueprint may be there. Can they identify it? And more importantly, can their players go out there and execute? We will find out on Saturday afternoon when the SEC West race continues to take shape. You can follow Brad on X at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me on social media at Todd Fuhrman. All right, my friend, great breakdowns from you and Mr. Powers, as always, on some of the marquee matchups of the college football weekend, with a lot of crown jewels and games that'll get national attention. It's the best bet portion of the program. Big game hunting for us, or are we doing a little bit of dumpster diving this fine Saturday?
Always a good question. I think we go big game hunting. We broke it down already. Kentucky, Georgia at the top, so it'll be time-stamped for you there, and you'll also have Brad's thoughts on the game as well, so it's worth a listen. But let's go with the under 48.5 in this game. To me, you have a slow Kentucky offense that is struggling with their down-to-down efficiency, and that's against lesser competition. Certainly, Ray Davis had a monster game last week, but I think it'll be a little bit different in Athens against a very challenged defensive front of Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs. You're looking at a Georgia offense that's certainly been passing a little bit more, but that third down, money down conversion rate that they had against Auburn last week, I think that ticks down a little bit and normalizes against Kentucky's defense. Now, certainly the Wildcats defense has not been tested, but I was very impressed by their front last week. We know they returned a bunch of starters there, did not get mauled in the trenches against a Florida team that likes to impose its will on the offensive trench. Georgia's offensive line, I think they'll be challenged, right? They certainly didn't play up to snuff last week. We thought that would be a great unit coming into the season, but they haven't gotten a ton of push along their offensive line. Mims is out, as Brad alluded to in that preview. So a little bit of a lower scoring game. The series has trended a little bit lower scoring as well. Let's go Kentucky, Georgia, under 48.5. Just if you're listening to this, right, we've kind of given everyone the blueprint. We understand you're busy, but you got to subscribe to the podcast, get the notifications, bet the best bet, and then go back and listen to the podcast in its entirety as you're driving to work, home from work, at the gym. If you're listening to this on Saturday, right, I don't want to hear I don't want to see the tweet. It's 46.5 now. Do you still like it? Like this is the market, right? The reason people listen to this podcast, why it's so valuable is knock on wood, we're hopefully able to beat the market here. But 48 is a very, very key number with totals. So get to that as quickly as you can.
A lot of fluidity in these prices, especially when we talk about totals compared to sides and everything else that goes into this entire exercise. So points at a premium Saturday night in Athens, and maybe, Payne, we get a Georgia shutout, a vintage defensive performance after Kirby challenged his stop unit, who could not slow down the dynamic tandem at quarterback of Robbie Ashford and Peyton Thorne that looked like the second coming of Michael Vick and Eric Crouch with some of the quarterback runs that we saw last weekend. All right, my friend.
And we discussed that specifically, right, in the breakdown. Again, time-stamped above, but that was an area that we outlined specifically, kind of divulging how distinctive the run games are different from Kentucky to Auburn. So don't expect Devin Leary to be that much of a threat in the ground game, and Georgia was actually pretty good there defending running back runs against Auburn.
No, exactly. It's all about the matchup sometimes. When you get caught looking at box scores, you just look at rushing yards. You can understand why Georgia struggled. You break down the tape. You understand it's a very different ground game that Georgia faced against the Auburn Tigers last week than they'll see with a little bit more pro-style sets from Liam Cohn and company this weekend. Another busy weekend, college football. Looking forward to it. It feels like every week we talk about teams that are going to get their litmus tests, those measuring stick games, as we begin to figure more and more out about the identities of all of these squads in college football. So encourage all of you guys and girls out there, like Payne said, subscribe to the podcast as soon as these things go live. Even if you have to do it backwards to forwards, listen to that best bet, then go back and listen to the breakdown to make sure you get to the best of the number. Any other words of wisdom, parting shots, things you'd like to pass along, Payne, before we reconvene 24 hours from now to tackle the behemoth that is the National Football League?
It has been a behemoth. Very good on the college front. Need to pick it up on the NFL side. Hopefully we get a little better variance this week than what unfolded last week there in Cleveland.
Long season, my friend. Zero doubts that we will get this thing turned around and be in a good spot for all the listeners and our bankrolls included. Best of luck with all of your college football investments this fine weekend. And with a Georgia-Kentucky under ticket in hand, we'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.